Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Canadian Football Central, CFL content for the fans, by the fans. And we are here with our Calgary Stampeders mid-season report card kind of video. And we got Ryan on from the Go Stamps Go podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, Ryan.
Well, it's good to be here. We're on hiatus this year, so I haven't had a chance to talk much CFL. So I kind of jumped at the opportunity.
Well, there you go. Glad to hear it. Well, and we've had a bit of an interesting season throughout the league. Personally, I've done terrible on picking games this year, as it's been so all over the place, and teams expecting to win, just finding ways to lose, and teams expecting to lose, finding ways to win, and seemingly that changing from week to week. And so overall, we kind of wanted to take a look through here, like the Stampeders as a whole, as that would be your forte. And so what is kind of your overall opinion being on the Stampeders, kind of that front bit of offense, so that offensive line, quarterback situation, Jake Maier and all that, and the running backs? How is that being for you?
Well, I mean, there's a whole lot of story in there. We'll start with the last thing you mentioned, which is the running backs. Obviously, Dedrick Mills leaving the team for personal reasons a few weeks ago, which really led to some struggles for the team, as they had they dressed 2 games with Peyton Logan as the only running back, and in one of those games they didn't even dress a fullback. So now they've got Kylan Hill back there. He was an Ottawa Red Blacks training camp invitee. Didn't make it through Red Blacks training camp, but did look good, I thought, last week in the game. Even though they lost that game on a walk-off field goal to Ottawa, I did think that Hill really looked solid as a runner when he got opportunities. He broke off a couple kind of 9-10 yard runs. And if he's able to provide that kind of offense for the Stampeders, it will kind of vary what they're able to do, because right now, when Peyton Logan is also returning kicks, you have to assume he's not getting the rock 20 times, which means you can drop back into coverage. You can put a little less pressure into the box, because you're not going to get slashed up by those runs. So if Kylan Hill is able to provide a little bit of run stability in that run game, and something they won't have had since Mills left, it might bode well for this upcoming match on Labor Day.
No, absolutely. Now, one of the things that we talked about, we had Coach Phil on earlier this year when we were earlier this year, 2 weeks ago, when we were doing our midseason report for Saskatchewan. And one of the things he was talking about was just that importance of that offensive line gelling together for both, and it'll make all the difference when it comes to the running game and the passing game. In terms of his riders, he was talking about how even though the Riders' offensive line has been able to do decent, they do decent with the Hickson style of running back. They haven't yet adjusted to that AJ Ouellette style of running back. How do you feel the offensive line's performance as being kind of in front of the running game on the running block?
Well, when you look at Calgary's rushing yards, they're kind of middle of the pack. They're averaging a little over 91 a game. Now, that also does need to take into account the idea that they just don't, it's not like Jake Maier takes off at all and runs the ball. And when Tommy Stevens is really only getting 1 or 2 yards at a time, but he's doing that 6 or 7 times a game, that's going to bring the overall average of the team down. So when you look they've only got 4.7 yards per carry. Well, you have to look at Tommy Stevens has got, I think it's 40 carries for 45 yards or something. So that really, once you take that out, Calgary's run game has actually been very efficient. And they're also not just doing well in the run blocking and allowing guys to get downfield. They're also doing well in pass blocking. For one point, and I'm trying to find the exact number right now, but I know a couple weeks ago they were among the league leaders in fewest sacks surrendered. Now, some of that is that Jake Maier is throwing away the ball a little earlier than he did before, but at the same time, that also means that they're not getting to Jake very quickly. So allowing him time to throw, that's why he's been more successful this year. You are still a little bit hit and miss with Maier's production, but when you look at what he's able to do when he does it, it's because the offensive line is blocking effectively.
And just a couple of things, Ryan. If you go onto CFL.ca and you look under stats through week 11, it's on page 5.
See, there we go. I was scrolling down trying to find it. I have it open in front of me.
And also to answer your question, Stevens has 41 carries for 123 yards and 8 touchdowns.
Yeah, so the 8 touchdowns are great, but all of those are 1-yard touchdowns.
Those are short yardage
and so the
pushes.
The 123, if you look, that's still only a 3-yard average.
Yeah.
So when you take those carries out of the mix from their statistics, you'd actually drive the average up quite a bit. Now that may be the same for every team. I can't say how many other carries they have, but a backup quarterback with 8 plunges for 8 touchdowns and 40 some odd carries through 9 games, that means he's taking 4 or 5 carries a game, which is fairly substantial throughout if you look at one half of a season.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I think this is something that me and Rick, we do our weekly previews and reviews of each week of the CFL. And one of the things that we talked about, especially a lot last year and a little bit this year, is that what is kind of your opinion on this very passing heavy like offense, in the sense of that the amount of times where we've gone through our weeks and I'm looking at the stat sheet and I'm like, Jake Mayer's at like 45, 42 attempts the night. And now, again, that's not every week, but even if I just go 2 weeks ago against Toronto, 33 completions on 45 attempts, Dickinson really like getting that ball in the air. And so, is this one of those things where, maybe this is making the Stampeders more predictable and this is more of a hindrance, or maybe it's one of those things where there's a lot of potential in that running game and it's just not fully being utilized. So I just kind of wanted to know your 2 cents on that.
Yeah, that Toronto game was the one where Peyton Logan was the only running back and there was no fullback. So it doesn't surprise me that Jake aired it out quite a bit.
That's true.
But Calgary also uses these kind of short passes instead of a running game. So you're looking at these, there's a lot of screen passes. There's a lot of short kind of 3-4 yard passes over the middle, which have a high completion rate, but they don't necessarily move the ball down the field. But is it much different than piling through the middle with a running back for 3 or 4 yards? That they're looking for first down production. Yeah, they're looking for first down production of between 6 to 7 yards, whether that's through the air or on the ground. They're looking for 6 to 7 yards on first down, like every team is. I mean, I'm not giving away any secrets here, but when you have that 6 to 7 yards on first down, second and manageable, the Stampeders are one of the best teams in the league at converting those second downs when they're in that area or continuing to stay on the field. So they're looking to get those kind of short yardage opportunities on second down. And when they do, they're effective. The problem is that when you're throwing the ball that often and when you throw the screen pass as often as they do, sometimes it does become predictable. Sometimes it does become scoutable. And it's not that, these guys need to it's that players are expecting it. And so now you need to make a man miss as opposed to being thrown into space. And I think what we see a lot of teams doing right now is attacking zones and things like that, whereas Calgary, instead of attacking the zone, is throwing that short screen pass and ending up with 2 or 3 yards or sometimes even a loss of yards on first down.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And it's funny because that's kind of a bit of a perfect segue into kind of talking about the receiving core that Calgary has. Again, you were talking about how, sometimes they'll go for that deep ball, but mostly this is a team that relies on a lot of short passes to quickly and just chip their way up that field. So who would you say is being maybe a bit of a standout when it comes to a receiver that does really, really well in just those short screen passes or those cross routes? What name comes to mind when I'm kind of talking about that?
Well, I think for me, the name that always comes to mind when you think about Stampeders receivers is Reggie Begelton.
Yeah.
And I don't care whether he's down the field, up the field, taking a screen pass, or running a crossing route. Reggie Begelton is the guy when it comes to the Stampeders receiving core.
He's the spearhead.
But on the flip side, yeah, he's absolutely, when Reggie's going, he's phenomenal. And you saw that last week with that 50-yard completion against Ottawa as well. Found himself wide open in space, still had to make a reasonable a reasonably tough catch, ended up falling down, I think at the 2, and it was 2 plays later it was in the end zone. But I think when you look at Reggie Bagleton, he's absolutely the straw that stirs the drink. Now, if you're looking for a name that's off the board and off that CFL top 50, I think Clark Barnes has done phenomenal work. If you look at his catch to target rate, he's catching almost everything that's being thrown his way most weeks. There have been weeks where it hasn't been working for him, but if you look at the balance of his performance throughout his career thus far, he's done incredibly well. As a late round Canadian draft pick receiver. And Ishmael Hyman has come into the lineup the last couple weeks and really stood out. I mean, he blew that Ottawa defender out of the water twice back to back, and ended up with a pass interference penalty as the defender dived at his arms, and then the second time corralled it and slid out at the 1 yard line. So Ishmael Hyman, I spoke to Jake Mayer after the game, and he said that he loves the idea of having a guy that can blow the top off a defense. Yeah. And he feels that that's something that's been missing from this Stampeders receiving core the last couple of years.
Yeah, and it's funny you were talking about kind of how Reggie Bagleton can kind of be a bit of that switchblade in the sense of that he's able to be that threat in those short passes, but then also he can be quite a lethal force when going downfield. And when you're attacking something like zone defense as opposed to man defense, I think that can be very, very important. As I mean, the CFL is a league that does a lot of zone defense naturally. That's just very much kind of more standard than man defense, I'd say so.
Too much space to cover.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think having a guy that's going to be able to do both of those is really important, because defenses will often try to somewhat cater in the sense of like they know teams know what other teams' number one and two, what their 1-2 punch is. And so when that 1-2 punch is going to be in a completely different zone each play, it's one of those things where it's harder to have match them up with someone a little bit more ideal. So I think that's a very, very smart thing that the Stampeders have done, which has kind of allowed a guy like Reggie Bagleton to be that spearhead. And I think bringing up Barnes is also a really good idea in terms of just a guy who's being able to kind of really kind of make his crack. And I think that really... if we're moving forward, him and Hyman have both been good options in this receiving core. Even early in the season, I remember Cam Eccles was pretty decent for you guys. And so it's been interesting to see kind of this receiving core develop, because it was one of those things where me and Rick are talking about, like in the sense of like, if you guys are going to be throwing like 45 attempts a game, it's very, very important that Calgary has that receiving core to be able to get it done. But then kind of there's the other side of things when we're looking on kind of the defensive side of the game. What's your opinion kind of being on that defensive house? So those linebackers, that defensive line, how has that front been for the Stampeders in your opinion?
I'm not sure what has gone wrong with the Stampeders defensive line and the Stampeders linebacking core, but they're getting gashed in the run game. Just sliced up, beaten up. They're allowing... I think against Ottawa last week, they allowed something like 9 yards a carry to the running back. I mean, it's just not possible to be successful in the CFL when you're allowing that kind of yardage to a running back. So I'm not sure what the difference is. I mean, there's obviously been changes along that defensive line. Last year, you had Derek Wigan in the middle. You don't have him there anymore. You have Mike Rose, who's getting all kinds of attention on every play. But they just haven't found the answer, and they've been rotating guys in and out on that defensive line all season, trying to have somebody make an impression, have somebody get in and do the work, and it just hasn't worked so far. Cam Judge and Micah Awe are sometimes dropping into coverage. I mean, I saw Cam Judge at safety on multiple occasions in that game against Ottawa, trying to confuse Jeremiah Masoli. But it's there's something wrong right now, and it was very interesting to hear Dave Dickinson after the game last week, because he said, "Look, we've got 18 days off, and so with 18 days off and NFL cuts all over the place, we're gonna go out and see if we can't find some help." So this team may look demonstrably different when they come back from this bye week on Labor Day against Edmonton than they do now.
Absolutely. And I think that that would be a very, very smart move in the sense of that when Sean Oakman kind of earlier in the season had become available, I thought there was going to be a few teams that were looking at him. And I thought that Calgary just had kind of struggled in that defensive line, so they might look towards him. Being from Winnipeg, I was kind of hoping that we'd maybe go after him just with all the injuries that we'd had on our defensive line. So I thought it was possible. We've seemingly got our defense figured out, so I have no problems with that now. But it's interesting that I think it's definitely probably being, I'm not trying to point fingers or anything, but it seems like it's been that defensive line has been a little bit of a sore spot for the Stampeders a little bit this year. And definitely a spot that if they're looking to make those improvements and look at kind of those guys getting cut from NFL rosters, all that sort of thing, I think that would be a very, very wise decision by them. When it comes to their linebacker core, I thought they've been decent and just kind of really depends on the game from what I have seen. They've definitely given up a bit more up the middle than would be ideal. Also, shout out a little bit to Micah Awe. Thanks for signing the hat and jersey. Really appreciate that. We had him on the show. Incredible guy, seriously. And it was a fun interview. Didn't realize that he had played with so many NFLers, Mahomes, and all that. But that kind of brings us a bit to the secondary here for Calgary. Now, first of all, I have to ask, as a Bomber fan, how you feeling about Demario Houston?
I mean, how do you not love Demario Houston?
Oh, I love
the
Demario
guy's
Houston.
making picks all over the place.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like it.
last week he had the game go through his hands in that play against Ottawa late in the game. It was thrown towards him, and he's normally so reliable in that way. I thought the game was over as the pass was going towards him, and then it somehow just gets into his hands, and the red-black receiver grabs it and falls at the same time. So it was a pretty unfortunate play for him in that moment, and for Stamps fans as well, who saw them lose at home for the first time this season. But Demario Houston's been everything as advertised and more for this Calgary team. There's no question that he was a deserved all-star, and he continues to be that way here in Calgary this year.
Absolutely. So how would, I guess kind of then going a bit more broad, how would your view be of the secondary just kind of a bit as a whole then for the Stampeders?
There are moments where this secondary suffers. Not often, I don't think they're giving up a ton of yards offensively in the pass game. I mean, I think they've been very good at holding, they were very good in both games against Vernon Adams in holding him to almost no points when everybody else, but for Winnipeg, has been kind of victimized by Vernon Adams and the BC Lions this year. The problem is the inconsistency from week to week with the Stampeders. Some weeks they look like they could beat any team in the league, and other weeks they just look like they can't put two and two together. And that consistency has plagued this team now for 2 seasons. And the question now becomes, it was in 2021, they won almost all of their games after the break. They came back. They had the midseason break. They came back after Labor Day, and I think they won 7 of 8 down the stretch to head into the playoffs before eventually losing in that semifinal. So are they able to duplicate that, or will they duplicate the trend that they had last year, where again it was win 1, lose 2, win 1, lose 1, win 1, lose 2? Like when they come back from this bye week, I think this home and home against a suddenly hot Edmonton Elks team is going to tell the tale of what the rest of the season is going to be in Calgary. If they don't come away with at least a split, if not a sweep of the Elks, I think Calgary's 17-year playoff streak could be in jeopardy.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a pretty crazy time in the West in the sense of that at the start of the year, it looked pretty kind of decently set in that that BC and Saskatchewan was that number 2 punch, and Calgary was kind of hanging around in that third position. Drop a little bit, you get Winnipeg, and then drop quite a bit, and you'd get Edmonton. However, everything's kind of this whole dynamic in the West is just almost being completely blown open. Saskatchewan is being good, but they've had times where they've kind of feigned a little bit. Edmonton's on a complete heater right now. Winnipeg seems like they're getting their crap together now with some guys coming off of injury. And BC is just completely fallen apart with 4 consecutive games. They bring in Nathan Rourke. Everything just does not go as planned in that first game back. And now that they got like, I don't even know, I think this year is like $750,000 in 2 quarterbacks, and it's going to be way more than that in coming years. So who knows exactly what's happening in BC. And so all in all, this has been a bit of an interesting time. Now, Rick, I do want to get into this a little bit. I think you know what I'm probably going to ask you here. Are you able to pull up the injury list here for Calgary? Just so we can...
I had that ready, my friend.
You had it ready. You knew I was going to ask you. Of course you did.
Hold on. Before we go into injury, I do have a quick question for Ryan.
Go for it. Shoot.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, so my question is, big elephant in the room, Malik Henry. He's been injured the last 2 seasons. Do you guys bring him back, or do you guys cut the losses and say, like, he's been injured the last 2 seasons, we move on?
I think you have to have him back. I think you have to find out if he's still got what he's capable of doing. Such a devastating injury to come back and battle all the way back to then have that injury happen again. Just a terrible thing for Malik Henry. And really for the Stampeders, because now for 2 straight seasons, you have this guy that had all the potential to lead the league in receiving, is now not there as a weapon, and you've lost that, and you need to find somebody else. And I think people underestimate the impact of what that was from a game planning perspective. Not just the impact on a week-to-week basis of what he brings to the offense, but also on a roster construction basis, because you thought you have Bagleton and Henry, so you don't need to go out and find another wideout in the offseason because he's going to be healthy. He comes back, he blows it out again, and now you're again left with Reggie Bagleton as your primary target, and everybody else needs to step up and take a step forward, as opposed to having the talent already there and be assured of what you're going to get with Malik Henry.
Yeah, I mean, and if we're looking kind of into things with him, it's one of those things they have to give him that shot, in the sense of I mean, look at what happened. Reggie White Jr. over in Montreal, seriously, all that time out, able to come back, shows he's still got it. After seeing that, you can't just, it's one of those things, like Calgary's got to give their own shot of that. And when you have that much talent on the table, unless it's one of those things where you've got guys coming up through the system that are kind of warranting a bit of that pay raise that you want to be able to keep around, and this is getting in the way of that, unless it's getting in the way of that, which I don't think it is in Calgary currently. I think it's one of those things you give him a crack at that. The only time I can think of where it was kind of getting in the way of that, big fan of him, but Jackson Jeffcoat in Winnipeg as that defensive end. It was one of those things where Celestion Haba very much was at that point where he was ready to take over the reins. He was going to be that other side of the bookends with Willie Jefferson, and Jackson Jeffcoat looking for that big extension, but he can't stay healthy. So Winnipeg at that point moves on because they got a guy who's ready, and if they sign Jeffcoat, that kind of leaves him hanging behind. But I don't think that's the situation here with Malik Henry over in Calgary. And so I think that they definitely got to bring him back if they got the opportunity to. So
yeah, and I still think we're also at a spot too where Jalen Philpott is, I would say, healthy-ish. Yeah. I would say that they're still managing him. They're still reducing his opportunities. He's not getting a full load in the offense because he's another guy that has spent, most of the 2 years of his career on the injured list. And so they're trying to get him to ensure that he can survive through the course of the season. So I think there's just opportunity there for guys to come back, possibly from injury. Kamar Jordan was a guy that did it here. He missed most of 2 years. He came back. He was okay for one season, and then he was eventually released because he wasn't the player he used to be. But I think Dave Dickinson is going to give Malik Henry the opportunity to prove that he either is or isn't the player he used to be.
Yeah. You're Rick, you able to go through those injuries now?
Yeah, so I have 4 people on the one game, which is McEwen, Odoms, Dukes, which is another person that kind of you'd think that where's he been all this season, but wasn't he on the 6th game, Ryan?
He's been healthy scratched a couple times. He's been bypassed on the depth chart by guys, like Eccles, like Hyman. So he's there, he's available, but there's not a spot to start Trey Odoms Dukes right now. So every week he shows up as healthy scratch. They keep him on the one game so that he's not. So I think he's still getting his game check.
Yep.
As opposed to practice rostering him. I think what they're afraid is if they put him on the practice roster, another team will claim him. And so as a result, they're keeping him on the roster and putting him on that one game every week.
So after Trey Odoms Duke, you have Nick Stats, Charles Wiley, all on the one game. 6th game, I apologize if I butcher this, Daniel Adamakoko. Did I butcher that, Ryan?
I'd have to see it to say it.
A-M-O-A. Yeah, A-M-O-A-K-O. He's a defensive DB.
He's a defensive back. Yeah, the benefit of not doing the podcast this year is I haven't had to say his name out loud. I only have to write it for freedom. But I think it's Amoko. But regardless, he's been on the 6th game almost all season. We did have an article that came out this week that said that Calgary has missed more man games or tied for the most missed man games this season so far. I believe they're tied with Toronto for the most man games missed out. And John Hodge, our erstwhile editor, put that list together and figured out how many man games are missed. And with the Stampeders, it's I think they're over 100 and they've played 10 games. So it's an average of 10 games per week that the Stampeders are missing 10 injured players.
So, a lot of
then you have BJ Emmons, Malik Henry, Jason Javier Messier, defensive lineman, Adam Knorr, William Langless. Here's another one, Tyson Middlemost. You would thought, where was he? Here's the one that scratches my head because I've not seen him play yet. Matt Schiltz. What the heck happened to him that he ended up on the 6th game?
He rolled his ankle.
At what, practice?
Yeah. He got injured in practice. He's got an ankle injury. He's been on the 6th game now for a couple of weeks already. But yeah, we haven't seen him. William Longleg was injured before in the preseason as well. Most of these guys have been injured for the entire year.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not sure what happened to Tyson Middlemost from an injury perspective, but again, most of these guys have been on that 6-game list since the season started, and they just stay there and will be staying there, many of them, for the rest of the year. I think there's no expectation that BJ Emmons is coming back. He looked very promising in the preseason. And in that first game of the year as a backup to Dedrick Mills, he had actually supplanted Peyton Logan on the roster those first couple weeks. So it's unfortunate to see what happened to him, but it just over and over and over again with this Stampeders team these last couple seasons, their injury list is very, very long. There is a question in Calgary whether or not the turf has anything to do with that, because the turf is now, I believe it's intended to be replaced between this season and next, because it has reached the end of its effective life. And there's questions around this team whether or not that turf being, at the end of its life, or maybe even a year past its effective life, if it should not have been replaced already. And as a result, the Stampeders might be seeing more injuries than they should be because that turf isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Now, a question I have in regards to the turf has and them replacing it. Has there been any conversations about possibly going to natural grass or no? At least that you've heard of.
No, no, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Natural grass is expensive.
It is expensive.
Um,
It's expensive to maintain, although I do know the players love it. So just figured I'd
yeah,
ask. And then also with
it's
certain soccer requirements, it's one of those things where there are certain places. I think BC Place actually, they're going to be having to get. I think they have to have grass for some
World Cup.
World
for
Cup.
where
Yeah.
or was it World Cup or Copa America? It was one of those two that they were
World
gonna,
Cup in 2026.
That's what it was.
Yeah,
Yeah, but I know they
World
need
Cup in
natural grass.
2026.
So,
There,
so
and
yeah,
and I mean they're obviously not going to tear out their turf and put in grass. They're probably just going to put in a grass surface over
that's
top,
true.
which is the which has happened and does happen elsewhere. I think that I can't remember where the stadium is, but it's an indoor stadium where they play on natural grass, and in between games, like one whole side of the stadium opens and they
I can think of
drive the
multiple.
grass out. Yeah,
They
into the
they do
sunshine,
this in
let it
Vegas.
grow all week, and then drive it back in.
They do this for Vegas. It slides out of the building for the Raiders, as well as I believe the Cardinals as well have that with their buildings. Although unfortunately CFL doesn't quite have that kind of money.
No,
but
no, but I do think it's almost impossible. I think to think that they're going to go to natural grass at McMahon. There's too many other things that happen there.
yeah,
You know, when you're looking at those natural grass stadiums for those kind of events, I mean they're specialty events or they're getting used more frequently. I just don't think that the Calgary Stampeders are at all interested in the costs of maintaining a natural grass field.
that's fair. One thing that's also a very important thing to mention where you're talking about natural grass is that with a lot of venues, they try to get as much usage out of them as they can. So one of those is concerts, is other events. When you have concerts on natural grass, it kills the grass. Like it's one of those
Yes.
things where it's like growing up in Winnipeg, we have a baseball team here called the Winnipeg Goldeyes. They just play in American Association, so around roughly like AAA level. And the next 2 weeks after a concert, you can tell if a concert's being there's a big dead rectangle straight in the middle of the outfield. And so it's one of those things where when it comes to CFL, I'm sure their standards are probably a lot higher than American Association when it comes to that sort of stuff. And again, this kind of goes towards those maintenance costs of maintaining a field, especially if I believe, does Calgary have a CPL team, Premier League?
They do, but
Uh,
I don't. It's not in the same
They
stadium.
don't play there.
They don't
Yeah,
play
they
Mc-
don't.
Okay,
They don't play
just figured
Mc-
I'd ask just because in Winnipeg, Valor FC does play at IG Field, so there are costs when it comes to repainting and constantly reconverting that. And it would not surprise me if it's different on turf versus grass. So
Calgary's field is sewn in. It's not. Calgary's field is sewn. It's not painted.
oh, it's sewn
Um,
in. Oh, I see. I
It's
see.
sewn in. So the turf is white where
Yeah,
the
it
line
just is
should
white.
be.
Yep.
Yeah, it's sewn in, not painted. But I mean, when it comes to that, yeah, the Surge play here, or no, the Surge, yeah, no, the Surge is the basketball team. You can tell how much I care about the CPL.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's escaping me entirely.
We're here
I
for
wanna
Canadian
say
football.
Ford. I'm not sure.
No, it is. Give me 1 second. It's Valor.
Valor,
No,
No, it's
Valor
not
FC's
the Valor.
no. It is Cavalry.
Yes,
Calvary. There you go.
Cavalry.
So, Ryan, I do have a question for you.
Shoot.
Is Calgary hoarding Craig Dickinson so he can be part of next year's coaching staff? Because what is a senior consultant, really?
I don't know. You've got a Hamilton jersey on. Tell me what Chris Jones is calling plays for free.
I mean, that's how we get. Hey, I mean, They bought out his
Someone- I was-
contract, so we don't have to pay him for the rest of
The
the season.
second I heard the rumor about that, I messaged one of Rick's buddies. I'm like, can you send him a heart rate monitor right now?
Well, no.
Yeah,
So the interesting thing about that was, I heard rumblings that someone's seen him in a mall in Hamilton, probably about Thursday, Friday, and I'm like, it's just some random fan who believes random fans anymore. And then and then someone said Saturday, oh, he's in Hamilton. I'm like, okay, I will at least give the benefit of doubt and let Farhan or someone from TSN or 3 Down or someone mention it, because obviously who's going to believe a random fan? And then it's like, Carter, it was our live stream yesterday. We're doing a live stream of the BC Winnipeg game the other day. And as soon as we started, I'm like, Carter, the world has come to an end. He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, Mark Washington got the working papers. Let's go. And then I'm going through all the forums on CFL.ca. There honestly is more fans happy that Washington's gone than us having Chris Jones for the rest of the season. Because, I mean, if Chris Jones...
To be fair, this is him as a defensive coordinator and not as a head coach, so...
Yeah, so, I mean, if you think about it...
general manager.
Yeah, or general manager.
Or general manager. Yeah, good God. It's one of those things.
Yeah.
You want to talk about like ironclad contracts? There you go.
Milanovic still has another year or two left on his contract, so unless they give him the walking papers, but
fair enough.
No, if Hamilton hires Chris Jones, they deserve everything they get. If they entrust any franchise at this point, and I'll say it loudly, clearly, and often, any franchise at this point that looks at what Chris Jones left behind when he left Saskatchewan to go coach high school football, and then what he's left behind in Edmonton, and thinks he's learned his lesson, you deserve it.
Here.
If this is what you see from Chris Jones, you deserve it. I think he historically has been a very good defensive coordinator. However, he has been the defensive guy in Edmonton for the last 3 years when they got blown out every week. So I don't know why people think, oh, well, just taking the responsibility will make him back to being a better defensive coordinator. I don't know that the game hasn't passed his defensive schemes by. We'll see, but
I think he's got Ken Holland syndrome if we're comparing him to the NHL in the terms of just there was a time in which he was able to get stuff done, but that time is coming more and more to its end. And I mean, it's looked like that the past 3 years in Edmonton. And so, I mean, I'm not trying to turn this into a Ticats video.
But my only thing about it is I got sick and tired of seeing Mark Washington zone. We need to stop playing zone, throw some man in there, throw some blitches in there, and then things will freaking change.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, can't be worse, right?
That's right. We're giving up 40 points a game.
At this point, what do you have to lose by bringing in Chris Jones except, integrity? But I think if you look at the league, I mean, the guy's been gone for 3 weeks. The guy's got, he's 3 cats worth of lives. Chris Jones right now.
They're trying to bring back the 2012 Toronto Argos where you had Orlando Steinhauer as the DB coach. Milanovic, what was he, a head coach and offensive coordinator? Chris Jones, the defensive coordinator. They're thinking, we'll get the boys back together again.
Now, anyways, going back to Calgary.
Yes. Sorry.
Cycling back
Let's
to that.
Stop talking about former defensive coordinators for the Stampeders.
Exactly. Fair enough. Who would you say, if you name one or a few or however many you got, would be compared to expectation, has surprised you in a positive way, maybe on the negative side of things too?
Wow. I think I actually don't know that there's any positive surprises on this team. I think the guys that have stood out are guys I expected to stand out. Even back to Clark Barnes. I think Clark Barnes last year is, if he doesn't get injured halfway through the season, is the Stampeders Rookie of the Year candidate. So for him to come out and play as well as he has this year, I think has been, has been to expectation. You can't look at Jake Mayer and his statistics and say that the guy that is, he's second or he's third in yardage. He's tied for second in touchdowns. He's got the lowest interception percentage among any regular starter. All of that makes that difficult to be like, oh, well, Jake Mayer hasn't lived up to expectations. I'm not sure what expectation you wanted out of the guy. He wasn't going to come out and be the best quarterback in the league. Nobody was expecting that. And he's better off in the top half of efficiency. He's a top tier quarterback as far as the CFL is concerned this season, right? Zach Caleros isn't there. Vernon Adams Jr. has been the guy, but Trevor Harris has been injured. Jake Mayer, give him credit. The guy's made 35 starts in a row, and last week, 7 out of 9 CFL teams were starting guys that weren't starting the week before.
Yeah.
So when you look at this past weekend of action, to say that when you look at Masoli started for Ottawa, you had Harris coming back and starting for Saskatchewan. You had
Rourke in BC.
Rourke in BC. You had Toronto had everybody.
Well, Toronto's been shuffling the quarterbacks, and it's been a whole mess there. Yeah.
But so to that point, Jake Mayer's not getting shuffled. Jake Mayer is producing numbers. Jake Mayer is he? And I think he really suffers by comparison to two generations of Stampeders, because we're all willing to forget the Frederick Box years of the guy who bought his team so his son could play, right? There was that nasty stretch before Huffnagel came back in 2008. When Huffnagel came back in 2008, you had Henry Burris into Drew Tate, into Kevin Glenn, into Bo Levi Mitchell, all of whom were decent starters, capable of making the wow play, right? Capable of finding the win, capable of driving the field. And it's not that Jake Mayer's not capable of that, but you never see like the desperation heave that gets brought down 50 yards downfield, and everyone says, what a miracle throw that he stood in there and made that throw. He's quiet efficiency. But at the same time, the Stampede, Tommy Stevens leads the league in touchdowns, in rushing touchdowns, and Jake Mayer is second in passing touchdowns. And somehow yet still, the Stampeders offense is disappointing,
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to me that after looking at, the Flutie into Garcia, into Dickinson, into Burris, and then eventually to Bo Levi Mitchell, you've got like 30 years of Hall of Fame quarterbacks that have come through Calgary, but for, again, that brief moment where even Matt Dunnigan got to coach here. But those moments where it just, so now Jake being an effective game managing quarterback, it's not enough. And he's not, it's not enough for the fans, and they get frustrated when they see what he's doing. But I also don't think they give him enough credit.
Like, there's even some, I was going to say, there's even some games where you'll see him throw like 1 touchdown, 2 touchdowns. Who would even have thought that he's second in passing yards and second in touchdowns? And you don't see him throw 3, 4 touchdown games like you see Cody, Harris, Vernon Adams.
Yeah.
Just consistency.
And now, one of the things, and you brought this up, and I think this is a really good talking point, because this is something that we haven't really talked about, and I don't know if I've really seen anyone talking about, is just in the sense of how important, it's funny, it's not really, I don't know if I wouldn't really consider it a skill, but more of just an asset to a team. When it comes to staying healthy and just not getting injured, there are certain players who are just more durable. There are certain players who they're able to play those full seasons for years on end and go with like maybe a week or two out from tweaking something a little bit, and that's about it. And so that's a crucial thing to have. In the sense of you can have the best starting whatever position it is, it really doesn't even matter. You can have this best starting whatever, but if he's only able to play 2-3 games a year, are you really getting your money's worth? Because you have to think about how much you're paying these guys. And I know when you put them on the 6 game, the league covers that salary, and there's all the cap stuff when it comes to that. But it's one of those things where it's like players are only good if they're playing. So.
Yeah, it reminds me of way back in the Wayback Machine. We had Nick Lewis on our podcast, and we were talking about his durability and the idea that he was always there, he was always healthy, and he always played. And he said it's all well and good to have a Ferrari, but if you can only drive it once or twice before it breaks and goes into the shop, wouldn't you rather have the pickup truck instead? Because the pickup truck is always going to be there. You're always going to drive it, and it's never going to break down. And he was equating himself and Maurice Price at the time, who, Maurice Price would come out and he'd, 3 touchdowns in 2 games, and then he'd be injured again. And that was his whole time here. He was constantly on and off the injured list. Nick Lewis was constantly at the first down marker, taking a pounding, but getting back up and signaling first down. So I think it is something to be said for Jake Maier, who I believe, and I'm not off the top of my head absolutely positive, but I believe that the Labor Day game, assuming he starts, will be his 35th or 36th consecutive start, which is the 4th longest streak in Stampeder history.
Wow.
So he's climbing that kind of rank of guys that have played a long time, and he's slowly kind of, again, just putting it together. There's not a lot that's flashy about Jake Maier's game, but there is a lot about that consistency. His consistency is going to give you that 250 and a touchdown, or maybe a touchdown and a half a week, and 3/4 of an interception if you want to rank it out by averages. That's not the worst thing to have in this league, if you can know that you're going to consistently get the same kind of performance from a quarterback.
Yeah, being able to go an average of 2-1. I got his stats pulled up here. 14 touchdowns so far in the season, 7 interceptions. Right now, so far, 2,624 passing yards. And last year, his number, which I don't know, I can't remember exactly if he finished number 1 or number 2. He was very high up in terms of his finish.
But again, because everybody else was injured.
4,244 yards.
4,200 yards is not a terrible season.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. No.
And that was on a team that was
third.
12.
He was third.
Yeah.
Top 3 in the league is good.
Yeah. Now again, would there have guys have been ahead of him if you look at a per game average and you prorate that over the season? Sure, but that doesn't mean that they're better because they weren't able to stay healthy.
They
found themselves on the sideline. They found themselves not able to go. And Jake Maier every week is under center, taking the snap, and when he does get hit, he gets right back up and runs to the huddle.
And now one thing I will say that is looking like it's an improvement over last year. 19 touchdowns, 15 interceptions last year. So nearly in that 1-for-1. Right now he's 2-for-1, exactly 2-for-1 with 14 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. So I think being able to cut back, even if it's one of those things where his yards are probably going to end up being similar to what he gets last year, being able to cut down on those picks it is important. And so it's definitely been a bit of an interesting ride here for Jake Maier, as it's one of those things where now this is not exclusive to Calgary. This is every team has this. Whenever teams have a disappointing loss, or maybe they have a disappointing string of losses, or whatever it is, everyone is trying to diagnose the problem. And so it's one of those things where I've seen a lot of whenever the Stampeders get a little bit of trouble, I've seen, Jake Maier, he's not that guy. He's not that number one flashy quarterback that this league sometimes has when it comes to Vernon Adams Jr. He's a very flashy quarterback. This is a guy, he'll escape the pocket and just slip out of everyone's fingers. I mean, we had Michael Awe on, and he said Vernon Adams Jr. is the slipperiest quarterback in the league, in the sense of is that you can have him in your grasp and he will find a way out of it. Jake Maier's not a flashy quarterback in that sense. But if I'm looking at the Stampeders and I'm looking at where at least I've seen their problems, I'm not sure that he's necessarily the problems. Am I saying that necessarily this is the Grey Cup going to happen? I don't know. Maybe. It's possible. But in terms of standout problems, I'm not sold on that.
Well, I also think the flip side of that is there are moments where he could go downfield and doesn't. There are moments where he could take off running and doesn't. And so there are those things that need to be developed within Jake Maier's game as a CFL starter. But I also want to point out, you did say it was a 2-to-1 touchdown to
that is correct.
Touchdown to interception ratio. I wanna go back a little bit too, because if you look at the last 11 games of last season, that touchdown to interception ratio, I believe he had, I'm just looking at it now, he had 11 touchdowns against 4 interceptions in those last 11 games last year. So when you look at his overall number from last year, it was not great from a 15-to-1 or a 19-to-15 ratio. But if you looked at the beginning of the season, at one point he was 4 touchdowns against 7 interceptions, and he came back to overwhelm that. So I think he's getting better at taking care of the ball. And let's not act like he's, this wily veteran either. Vernon Adams Jr. is the player he is now later in his career.
Let's say Jake Maier's only 27.
Zach Collaros is later in his career. And so these guys inherently have become great CFL quarterbacks, but nobody was saying that they were lighting the world on fire, a couple of years before that. Vernon Adams Jr. bounced around to half the teams in the league. Yeah. And they went and may yet again in this offseason, because I think what you said earlier is correct, that they're not going to be able to afford to keep them both heading into next season.
It'll really depend on Vernon Adams
Jr. May yet. Well, I think long term you're going to get
probably going to commit on Rourke.
I don't know that it was fair to ask a guy to have one practice with the starters.
Oh, absolutely.
And come in and light the world on fire after being gone for a year and a half.
That's true.
I think that's not necessarily fair from an expectation standpoint. What he was. And
I'm not saying that is representative of of Nathan Rourke as a player. I want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah.
But I will. No, but it's one of those things where I was expecting him to not throw 300. Wasn't quite expecting 32%. But fair enough in that regard. But it's one of those things. He's got time to improve. He'll be just fine. Yeah. But Jake Maier, you're right. Only 27 years old, and to be honest, that's the reason Calgary is, from a quarterback perspective, is in their situation where Jake Maier's that number one guy, is because when Bo Levi Mitchell left, it was kind of one of those things where it's like, okay, this guy's got a few years left on it. This team is, they're not championship material right now, but we have to look towards the future and what we can build. And this is a guy that we can build around. He's young, because Bo Levi Mitchell leaves 2 years ago, so 2022. Jake Maier plays. Yeah,
he's replaced as the starter in 2022.
2022, he's replaced at the starter. You just get a little bit of that Bo Levi Mitchell a little bit through portions of the year, and then also a little bit in the playoffs. Leaves after that, so it's one of those things. Jake Maier, 25 years old at the time. He's got a long time, and it's one of those things with the numbers that he's throwing. Even if for some reason Calgary gave up on him, I would be shocked that no one else takes a crack at him. But I don't see Calgary doing that. It's also kind of curious in the terms of when you have a player like that and there's certain aspects of his game that he can improve or that he can improve on, or that parts of the game that are his strengths. It's interesting kind of seeing when you have different kinds of offense, different offensive coordinators will run their offenses differently. I don't know if maybe he would thrive under another guy's system. I don't know if maybe the system he's in is good and things just kind of need to get going and he just needs a bit more time to really flourish. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think Jake Maier has been solid overall.
Well, and again, when you look at it, I mean, let's run down your starters. You've got Bo Levi Mitchell and Hamilton now likely starting again because of the injury to Taylor Powell.
Yep.
So Bo Levi Mitchell, 34 years old. Vernon Adams Jr., 31 years old. Zach Collaros, 35 years old. Bethel Thompson, 36 years old. Drew Brown is also 27. Cody Fajardo's 31. Trevor Harris is 35. Like, all of these starters around the league are all well into their 30s,
with the exception of Drew Brown.
With the exception of Drew Brown, but Drew Brown is now injured as well.
That's true.
And Jeremiah Masoli was the starter last week.
Let's not even get started on Mazzoli injuries. My God.
Right? But we're in a standpoint where when you look at the experienced quarterbacks that are starting around this league, you can't look at Jake Maier and say he's got the same kind of experience. I wouldn't look at Drew Brown and say he's got the same kind of experience. Absolutely. I would look at him and say he's a young quarterback who is developing. But because Maier supplanted Bo Levi Mitchell, the expectation for him is much higher than it should be. Yep. Because he was the guy that was good enough to knock out the only quarterback to win 2 Grey Cups as a starter here, the only quarterback to win, he was winning MOPs and everything else. And that wasn't a byproduct of Bo. That was a byproduct of Bo's injuries, not because of his inability at quarterback. It was his physical limitations that lost him the starting job.
Yeah. Now, one thing I will say about that is how, again, it's one of those things where with Bo Levi Mitchell, there has been that expectation that Jake Maier maybe kind of succeeds and is able to carry on with that. But it's one of those things, again, he won't be able to do that immediately. And with some more time, that they might be able to get that done. Now, if we're kind of looking towards this season and kind of their future going forward, so we're currently on week 12, in the middle of a bye week. Then week 13, you guys come back for the Labor Day game, Battle of Alberta against Edmonton in Calgary. Then the following week against Edmonton again, this time in Commonwealth Stadium in Edmonton, followed by Montreal, week 15, and then 16 against Saskatchewan. And
so Carter, in a nutshell, they play Edmonton 3 times. They play Montreal, 2 against Saskatchewan, 1 against BC, and 1 against Hamilton.
How are we feeling about...
2 against Saskatchewan, my bad.
How are we feeling about Calgary moving forward with that kind of a schedule?
I'll have a much better answer for that in 3 weeks. I think if they can come out and sweep Edmonton, then I think they've got a legitimate shot at the playoffs again. I think they need to... I think the mark for the playoffs in the league this year will be probably 9-9. I think you need to be in that 9-9 mark to be safe to make the playoffs this season in the CFL. And so, Saskatchewan's lost 4 in a row. BC's lost a bunch in a row. Will their skids stop? Will they, will they find their groove again or not? I think there's a lot of questions to be answered in the West Division, and I think it's going to be wild coming down the stretch. But that said, Calgary's found a way in for 17 years in a row. Yeah. There's no other.
You got that
CFL
Red Wings playoff
more
streak.
Than 7. Yeah, there's no more. I think the second longest streak in the league is Winnipeg with 7. So I think when you look at that, there's no reason to believe they won't make the playoffs and they won't find a way in until they don't. And so I'm willing to say that they're going to get to that 500 mark. I think they can get there, and I think that they can make the playoffs. Now, whether or not they do anything in the playoffs is a totally different story.
Yeah.
But I think they can get there.
Now, what is their? How are they doing against BC and Saskatchewan? And the reason I'm asking that is because I know Winnipeg has the tiebreaker against Calgary. They had went for the 2-point conversion in that game against Winnipeg. Winnipeg able to secure that. How are they doing against BC and Saskatchewan in that regard?
They're 1-1 against BC, and they haven't played Saskatchewan yet.
Okay, so then
Saskatchewan will be that 2-game season series,
yeah.
and BC will be a tiebreaker. The team that wins that will win the season series.
Okay, so then that means this is all open in the air, because I think probably if you're Calgary right now, I mean, it's kind of difficult, because in the sense of Winnipeg plays Hamilton, that game, they're just hoping for Hamilton to win, get points out of the West and over in the East. And then when it comes to that Saskatchewan-Winnipeg series, I think it really will depend on if Saskatchewan looks like they're dropping a bit and Winnipeg looks like they're kind of starting to shoot up. Does maybe Calgary hope for Saskatchewan to win both of those games or against Winnipeg, or do they hope for Winnipeg to win those in the sense of that obviously Calgary doesn't want to be in a tiebreaker with Winnipeg for obvious reasons. So maybe it helps Calgary for Winnipeg to maybe succeed against Saskatchewan and then maybe be able to have that opportunity to gain that tiebreaker against Saskatchewan, as a tiebreaker somewhere in the West is a very real possibility with how tight this is right now, and Edmonton now looking to find themselves a way back into a fold, which I mean that could make or break when it comes to these two games between Calgary and Edmonton. This is going to be absolutely crucial. So I'm just not sure. But looking into kind of, I guess, kind of wrapping this all up, how would you where do you think Calgary is going to finish in the standings? And what would be your grade based on expectations, letter grade for this season?
I think against expectations, I would say that the letter grade is probably a B. Nobody was expecting them to be world beaters this year, and with the injuries they've suffered, losing Malik Henry again, I don't think that anybody was picking the Stampeders to run the West and run through the West. To answer your question earlier, I think that the best thing for the Stampeders in that Labor Day home and home between Sask and Winnipeg is actually split. It gets them one game closer to Saskatchewan, who's only a game ahead of them in the standings, and if they were to sweep Edmonton, obviously, and it would also create one game of distance between them and Winnipeg, who they are currently tied with in the standings, but losing that tiebreaker. So a split there, if Calgary's able to sweep, gets them into a tie with Saskatchewan, and also gives them one game distance over the Bombers. But as far as the rest of the season goes, I'd expect Calgary to come out and make the playoffs. Whether or not, I don't think they're going to be hosting a playoff game. I think they're on the road for the playoffs, but I do think they'll be in the playoffs and give me a 9-9, possibly a 10-8 finish.
That's fair. Rick over there, how are you feeling about Calgary in terms of wrapping up this season? As I think both of us actually predicted Calgary to kind of drop down a little bit in the sense of not that Edmonton was necessarily going to rise above them, but just that, I mean, I never expected Winnipeg to fall off the way they did. Saskatchewan had tons of pieces. Corey Mace, there was a lot of promise there. I think they've exceeded expectations in that regard. And with BC, I think pretty much everyone expected them to be a really strong contender. Where do you...
And here's the interesting point. You have Calgary and Winnipeg both at 8. Toronto's at 10. You know what Rourke did yesterday? Chad Kelly's not supposedly, but they're splitting the quarterback duties on Thursday against Saskatchewan. Does Winnipeg or Calgary go to the east and do a west to east crossover? There's different ways that this could finish.
I think that really only matters if Toronto is able to go on quite a heater with Calgary, and Ottawa is able to stay consistent, but maybe possibly get pushed back down into that third spot. I don't really know. It's always difficult for that crossover. I'm not sure.
I mean, Toronto and Ottawa both have a game in hand, so.
And Toronto, even Toronto at 10 points would be second place in the West. So I don't anticipate Hamilton will cross over, certainly, but I'd be surprised if there was a Western crossover this year, given that you do have Chad Kelly coming back. Not that I think he should be. I think he should have been. I think he should have just been drummed out of the league. And for anybody who says, "But we don't know what happened in Toronto," sure, research Chad Kelly and then come back and tell me that he's a guy that deserves even a last chance, let alone a second chance. Um, and to have his agent complain about it, complain about the conditions of this last chance, man, like, yeah, not a fan. But I think when you look at those teams, I'd be surprised if you got a fourth place team in the West, given how many games are still interlocking in the West. If one of them would be good enough to bypass Toronto's record.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if that wasn't happening with Toronto, I'd say it's possible. But even then, the crossover is something that it's not something we always see. It's always less likely than more likely. And there's a lot of games within the West that are still left to happen that will kind of be a big influence on who is able to get into that Western playoff spot. So unless that bottom half of the East falls off and there's a lot of splits within the West, and we have a lot of situations where teams are in their spots because of tiebreakers, which, I mean, we might see one, but I don't know. I'm not necessarily convinced that it's enough to cause a crossover. May have possibly said that earlier in the year. Just not so sure now. There's just so many games within that division. But overall, if I'm putting like a letter grade on this team and kind of how they've done, I'd say probably B+ in the sense of just with, and some of that benefit is just kind of being teams going on a little bit of some skids here, and Calgary staying relatively consistent through this year and just kind of being covering around that 500. And so I give them probably a bit of a B+. Again, they've also dealt with a lot of injuries, like a few teams in the CFL. My Bombers very much one of them. And so overall, I think that Calgary is a team that you can never count them out. Again, they do have that playoff streak, and that's something to remember. And that's something that you can't forget about that. That's why I was saying, like, even like with my Bombers, it's one of those things where it's like, we started off, a little weak, but we've been to the last 4 Grey Cups for a reason. So it's always possible. And Calgary, they've managed to find themselves in a playoff spot for a reason. So I'll be curious to see exactly how the rest of the season goes. Is there anything else we have here, Rick?
Not for me.
Ryan, is there anything else you have?
No, just follow me on socials
There
at
we go.
BBCan Ryan everywhere you look, and check us out on 3 Down Nation.
There we go.
I was gonna say go Stamps Go show, but I don't know if you guys are.
Yeah, no, we haven't done an episode since just after Labor Day last year. Life just has gotten in the way for all 3 of us.
Fair enough.
And so maybe one day we'll make a triumphant return, but for now, the Go Stamps Go show is hiatus.
Well, here, if you're able to send me all those links to some of those socials, I'll put them actually all in the description below. So if you guys want to check out any of the stuff, make sure you guys check that out in the description below. There should be links to all sorts of that lovely content. So make sure you guys leave a like if you haven't already. Subscribe, hit the little notification bell, helps out the channel a ton. Again, thank you so much, Ryan, for coming on and giving us your time. Really, really appreciate that. And
yeah, my pleasure. Looking forward to the Grey Cup preview episode when we can talk about Calgary versus Toronto or something.
There you go. So there we go. And peace, love, and positivity, everyone. And have yourselves a wonderful day.